The final curtain fell with a whisper of velvet, but it was the sudden absence of sound that woke Alice Shelton. Not the applause, not the rustle of programs being tucked away, but the terrible, weighted silence that pressed against her like a physical thing. Her cheek was warm against something solid, her neck stiff at an awkward angle. The scent wrapped around her, sandalwood and bergamot, expensive wool, and something darker she couldn't place, leather, perhaps, or the faint metallic edge of cold authority. Welcome back, my amazing family. Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your love and support mean the world, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's get right into the story. She opened her eyes to find herself leaning against a shoulder. A man's shoulder. A stranger's shoulder. The mortification struck her like a fist to the stomach. Alice jerked upright, her gloved hands scrabbling against the silk cushion of the theater seat, nearly knocking her reticule to the floor. The man beside her didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still, his posture ramrod straight in a way that suggested he'd been acutely aware of her presence for some time. Around them, the grand auditorium of Drury Lane hummed with polite conversation and the shuffle of London's elite preparing to depart, but Alice could feel it, the shift in attention, the turning of heads, the whisper of scandal beginning to take shape. Her voice came out as barely a rasp. She cleared her throat, heat climbing her neck and flooding her face. Forgive me. I didn't mean to. The man turned his head with deliberate slowness, as though granting her his attention required careful consideration. He was younger than she'd expected given the severity of his bearing, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair that caught the gaslight in shades of bronze and sable. His face would have been devastatingly handsome if not for the Arctic assessment in his eyes, blue as winter frost, sharp as cut glass. There was something in the angle of his jaw, the commanding set of his shoulders, that spoke of generations of unquestioned power. Didn't mean to what, precisely? His voice was low, cultured, each word articulated with surgical precision. Fall asleep during the final act of Hamlet, or use the Duke of Ashbourne as your pillow. Alice's heart stopped. Then lurched violently back to life. Duke. The Duke. Harold Jones, the Duke of Ashbourne, the man they called the Iron Duke, in drawing rooms across Mayfair, whose glacial demeanor had sent 3 debutantes into tears at Lady Pemberton's ball last season. The man whose cold refusal of the princess's daughter had become the scandal of the summer. She'd been sleeping on Harold Jones's shoulder. Both, she managed, her hands twisting together in her lap. The gown she wore, her mother's, turned twice and let out at the seams, suddenly felt unbearably shabby. The lace at her cuffs was fraying. There was a small repair at the hem where she'd caught it on a nail last week. Neither. I'm so terribly sorry, Your Grace. She glanced around desperately. I should find my sister. One dark eyebrow lifted, a minute gesture that somehow conveyed volumes of skepticism. The sister who left you here to your own devices an hour ago. He stood with the fluid grace of a predator, offering his hand. I'm afraid you've created rather a delicate situation, miss. Shelton, she whispered, staring at his outstretched hand as though it were a snake. Alice Shelton. His eyes flickered with something, recognition, perhaps, or calculation. Ah. The Sheltons of Hampshire. Your father's estate bordered Ashbourne lands before it was sold, if memory serves. Before her uncle gambled it away, he meant. Before her father died and left them with nothing but debts and a crumbling townhouse in an unfashionable corner of London. The unspoken history hung between them like smoke. I should go, Alice said, rising without taking his hand. The blood rushed to her head, making her sway slightly. "I apologize again for the intrusion, Your Grace." "Too late for that, I'm afraid." Something almost like amusement colored his tone, dark and dangerous. "Do you see them?" Against every instinct screaming at her to flee, Alice followed his gaze. Across the auditorium, in the boxes that ringed the theater like a gallery of judgment, faces turned toward them. Opera glasses gleamed in the gaslight. Fans fluttered with increased velocity. In Lady Hartwick's box, 3 matrons had their heads bent together, their expressions ranging from scandalized to gleeful. "They'd been watching for the past 40 minutes, the Duke continued, his voice conversational, as though discussing the weather rather than her complete and utter ruination. "Watching you sleep against my shoulder with what I can only describe as riveted fascination. Lady Pemberton has already dispatched her niece to ascertain your identity. She'll arrive at this box within moments." Alice's stomach dropped through the floor. "Why didn't you wake me?" His smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Because, Miss Shelton, you've just solved a problem I've been attempting to navigate for the better part of 3 months." He stepped closer, lowering his voice until it was meant for her ears alone. "And now you're going to help me with it." Before she could formulate a response, before she could even process what he meant, the curtain to their box swept aside with a dramatic flourish. A young woman entered first, resplendent in rose silk that matched her perfectly rouged cheeks, blonde ringlets arranged in studied casualness. Behind her loomed an older woman in purple taffeta and enough amethysts to stock a jewelry shop. And behind them, making Alice's breath catch in genuine panic, came 3 more society matrons, each one a pillar of the ton, each one capable of destroying Alice's family with a single well-placed rumor. "Your Grace," the woman in rose said, her voice dripping honey and venom in equal measure. "I confess myself surprised. I wasn't aware you'd brought a companion this evening. How perfectly delightful." The Duke straightened to his full height, which was considerable. When he moved, the entire box seemed to rearrange itself around him, as though even the furniture recognized his authority. His hand came to rest at the small of Alice's back, warm, proprietary, utterly shocking through the thin silk of her gown. "Lady Eugenia," he said, with the barest inclination of his head. "Mrs. Crawford. Ladies. Allow me to introduce Miss Alice Shelton. A dear friend of my late mother's goddaughter." The lie was seamless, delivered with such casual confidence that even Alice almost believed it. Every rational thought in Alice's mind screamed at her to correct him. To explain the misunderstanding. To curtsy and flee and never set foot in a theater box again as long as she lived. Instead, she heard herself say, "The pleasure is mine, Lady Eugenia." The words emerged steady, shaped by her mother's painstaking lessons in deportment. "Just because we've lost our fortune doesn't mean we've lost our breeding," her mother used to say, drilling Alice and her sister in posture and pronunciation until they could pass in any drawing room in London. Alice had never imagined she would need those lessons quite like this. "Shelton," Lady Eugenia repeated, her eyes narrowing with the precision of a hawk spotting prey. "I don't believe I'm familiar with the Hampshire Sheltons." "A quiet family," the Duke said smoothly, his thumb making a small, deliberate circle against Alice's spine that sent electricity racing through her nervous system. "Miss Shelton prefers country life to the frivolities of the season. I had to exercise considerable persuasion to convince her to grace London with her presence." Another lie. Each one digging her deeper into a hole she couldn't climb out of. "How charming," Mrs. Crawford said, in a tone that suggested she found it anything but. "And did you enjoy the performance, Miss Shelton?" The question was a trap. Everyone in this box knew perfectly well that Alice had been unconscious for a significant portion of Hamlet. Everyone was waiting to see how she would navigate this particular minefield. Alice lifted her chin and met Mrs. Crawford's gaze directly. "I found Burbage's interpretation of the prince's madness particularly moving," she said, recalling the first act she'd managed to stay awake for. "Though I confess the tragedy of Ophelia's fate quite overwhelmed me. The Duke was kind enough to allow me a moment to compose myself." The Duke's hand pressed ever so slightly harder against her back, approval, perhaps, or warning. Lady Eugenia's smile grew sharper. "How very sensitive of you, Miss Shelton. And how generous of His Grace to provide such solace." Her gaze flicked between them, calculating, measuring. "One might almost think you were more than mere acquaintances." The moment crystallized. Alice could see the precipice before her. One word from the Duke and she would tumble into social oblivion. One denial and the rumors would savage what remained of her family's reputation. Harold Jones turned his winter blue eyes to Lady Eugenia, and when he smiled, there was something predatory in it. "One might indeed," he said softly. "In fact, Lady Eugenia, you've given me the perfect opening. Miss Shelton has done me the extraordinary honor of accepting my suit. We were planning to announce the engagement at my aunt's charity ball next week, but I see no reason for secrecy among friends." The world tilted. Alice felt the blood drain from her face even as Lady Eugenia's hand flew to her throat in shock. The other women began speaking at once, a cacophony of congratulations and barely concealed disbelief. Through it all, the Duke's hand remained steady at Alice's back, anchoring her to this impossible moment. She turned her head to look at him, and found him already watching her, those blue eyes holding a challenge and a promise and something that might have been desperation if Harold Jones were the sort of man who ever felt desperate. "You've already ruined your reputation," his expression seemed to say. "Why not let me pay you for the trouble?" And Alice, who had spent 23 years being sensible, being invisible, being the one who held her family together through sheer force of will, Alice, who had nothing left to lose and a sister whose future depended on a miracle she couldn't provide, found herself doing something utterly reckless. She smiled. "His Grace is too modest," she heard herself say, her voice carrying across the box with a confidence she didn't feel. "I'm quite certain I'm the fortunate one in this arrangement." The Duke's eyes flashed with something dark and triumphant. And just like that, Alice Shelton became a liar, a fraud, and the most unlikely fiancée in all of London. Alice had never been backstage at Drury Lane Theatre before. She'd never imagined she would be, certainly not at midnight, certainly not with the Duke of Ashbourne's hand wrapped firmly around her wrist as he guided her through a labyrinth of velvet curtains and rope pulleys and the lingering scent of grease paint and desperation. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice echoing off the wooden floorboards. "I really must insist. Harold." He stopped abruptly, turning to face her in the dim light filtering through the stage door. "If we're to be engaged, you'll call me Harold. The charade falls apart rather quickly if you keep addressing me like a petitioner at court." Alice's mouth opened, then closed. In the shadows, away from the gaslight and the glittering crowd, he looked different. Younger, perhaps. The severe lines of his face softened by the darkness, though his eyes remained just as penetrating. She pulled her wrist free, rubbing at the place where his fingers had pressed, not painfully, but insistently enough that she could still feel the warmth. "We are not engaged," she said carefully. "We're two people who participated in a mutually disastrous misunderstanding, and I would very much like to go home now and pretend this entire evening never happened. Would you?" Harold moved closer, and Alice fought the instinct to step back. "Return home to your uncle's townhouse in Clerkenwell?" The one with the notice of debt posted on the door as of last Tuesday. The air left Alice's lungs in a rush. How did you? I make it my business to know things, Miss Shelton. He gestured to a worn settee that had been pushed against the wall, probably discarded from some long-forgotten production. Sit. Please. This conversation requires clarity, and I prefer not to have you faint again. I didn't faint, Alice said indignantly, but she sat anyway. Her legs felt suddenly unsteady. I was merely tired. I'd been working on the household accounts until 3 in the morning, and then my sister insisted we attend the theater, and, she stopped, realizing she was babbling. How do you know about the debt notice? Harold remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested military training or endless etiquette lessons, perhaps both. Your uncle, Thomas Shelton, owes approximately £8,000 to various creditors across London. He's been barred from 3 gaming hells and 2 gentlemen's clubs. The bailiffs will come for the townhouse within the fortnight. Each word landed like a physical blow. Alice had known it was bad. She'd been the one desperately juggling the books, trying to make their dwindling funds stretch impossibly far, but hearing it stated so clinically, so completely, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. My sister, she whispered. Emma. She's only 17. If we lose the house, if the scandal. Precisely. Harold's expression didn't soften, but something in his tone shifted. Which is why my proposal, absurd as it may seem, serves us both. Alice looked up at him, this strange, cold man who had somehow upended her entire existence in the space of a single evening. What exactly are you proposing? 3 months, Harold said. You play the role of my besotted fiancé. You attend the necessary social functions at my side, you smile prettily when required, and you convince London society that the Duke of Ashbourne has finally succumbed to that most inconvenient of afflictions, romantic attachment. Why? Alice demanded. You could have any woman in London. Why manufacture an engagement with someone like me? Something dark flickered across his face. Because every woman in London wants to be the Duchess of Ashbourne. Their mothers want it. Their fathers want it. My aunt, who has made it her life's mission to see me married to the princess's insufferably tedious daughter, wants it desperately. He paused. But you, Miss Shelton, fell asleep on my shoulder. Not because you were executing some calculated scheme to trap me into marriage, but because you were exhausted from trying to hold your family together with nothing but determination and frayed nerves. Alice felt something twist in her chest, not quite sympathy, but recognition. And in return, she asked quietly. What do I receive for this performance? Harold's smile was sharp as a knife blade. I will settle your uncle's debts in full. All £8,000, distributed to his creditors with the understanding that the matter is resolved and the Shelton name is cleared. Additionally, I will provide your sister with a dowry of £5,000 and sponsor her entry into society next season under the protection of the Ashbourne name. Alice's heart stuttered. It was more than she dared to hope for. More than she could have achieved in a lifetime of scrimping and saving and fighting against her uncle's recklessness. And at the end of 3 months, she made herself ask. We discover we are incompatible. We part amicably. You return to your life with your family's finances secured and your sister's future guaranteed. I return to mine, having successfully discouraged my aunt's matchmaking efforts for at least another year. It was insane. It was dangerous. It was a lie that could destroy them both if discovered. Alice thought of Emma, who still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. Emma, who deserved a season, a choice, a life that wasn't dictated by their uncle's failures. She thought of the debt notice, the creditors circling like wolves, the slow suffocation of watching everything slip away despite her best efforts. "I have conditions," she heard herself say. Harold's eyebrow lifted. "Do you?" "The money goes directly to the creditors, not to my uncle. He doesn't touch a penny of it." Alice straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "And Emma, my sister, she can't know this is an arrangement. She has to believe it's real, or she'll never accept your help." "Agreed." Harold extended his hand. "Do we have a contract, Miss Shelton?" Alice looked at his outstretched hand, pale and elegant in the dimness. She thought about all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. She thought about the alternative, watching her sister's dreams crumble, losing their home, becoming invisible charity cases scattered among resentful relatives. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. "We have a contract," Alice said. "Harold." His smile was the first genuine one she'd seen, and it transformed his entire face. "Excellent. Then let's begin your education in becoming a duchess, shall we? We have 3 months to make London believe the impossible." The Ashbourne townhouse wasn't a house at all, it was a monument to power rendered in Portland stone and arrogance. Alice stood on the pavement of Grosvenor Square, her single traveling trunk looking pathetically small beside her, and tried not to let the sheer scale of the building steal what remained of her courage. 4 stories of pristine white stone rose before her, windows gleaming like watchful eyes in the morning sun. The black lacquered door alone was taller than any room in her uncle's crumbling townhouse. Footmen in Ashbourne livery, deep blue with silver braid that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe, flanked the entrance like sentries guarding a fortress. "Miss Shelton." The butler materialized at her elbow, elderly and impeccably dignified, his expression revealing nothing of what he thought about the Duke's sudden acquisition of a fiancée. "If you'll follow me, His Grace is expecting you in the morning room." Alice nodded mutely, climbing the stairs on legs that felt carved from wood. The entrance hall was a cathedral of marble and gilt, the ceiling soaring 3 stories above her head and decorated with frescoes depicting classical scenes she couldn't identify. A chandelier the size of a small carriage dripped crystal teardrops that caught the light and scattered rainbows across the polished floor. She'd known Harold was wealthy. Every child in England knew the Duke of Ashbourne commanded one of the largest fortunes in the kingdom. But knowing it and standing in the physical manifestation of that wealth were entirely different experiences. "This way, miss." The butler led her through a series of corridors hung with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, each one seeming to judge her for the presumption of walking these halls. Her worn half-boots made no sound on the Turkish runners, carpets that probably cost more than her father's entire estate had been worth before the debts consumed it. The morning room, when they finally reached it, was smaller than she'd expected but no less intimidating. Pale blue silk covered the walls, and windows overlooking the private gardens let in floods of natural light. Harold stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him as he gazed out at the manicured lawns. "Your Grace," the butler announced. "Miss Shelton has arrived." Harold turned, and Alice felt the now familiar jolt of seeing him in daylight. He'd dispensed with his evening clothes in favor of dark trousers and a burgundy waistcoat, his cravat tied with casual elegance. Without the theater's shadows to soften him, he looked every inch the aristocrat, and she felt every inch the impostor. "Thank you, Morrison. That will be all." Harold waited until the butler withdrew before crossing to where Alice stood frozen just inside the doorway. "You look terrified." "I'm not terrified," Alice lied. "I'm merely adjusting." To the house? Something that might have been amusement flickered in his blue eyes. It's ostentatious, I know. My grandfather believed in making statements. I've grown rather immune to it. It's lovely. Alice forced herself to move deeper into the room, though she felt acutely aware of how shabby her traveling dress must appear against such refined surroundings. The fabric was clean but worn thin at the elbows, the hem let down twice and still slightly too short. Very grand. It's a mausoleum filled with objects my ancestors acquired to demonstrate their superiority over their peers. Harold gestured to a settee upholstered in cream silk. Please, sit. You're making me nervous, hovering there like you expect the floor to collapse beneath you. Alice sat gingerly on the edge of the settee, her spine rigid. I don't wish to presume. Alice. Harold's voice cut through her anxiety with surgical precision. He settled into the chair opposite her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees in a posture that was distinctly informal. We established the terms of our arrangement 3 days ago. You have every right to be here. More importantly, if this charade is to succeed, you cannot look as though you expect to be thrown out at any moment. I'm not accustomed to. Alice gestured vaguely at the room, the house, the entire impossible situation. This. No one is, really. It's all rather absurd when you examine it. Harold's expression softened fractionally. But you'll grow accustomed to it, I promise. The house is large, but the staff are discreet, and most of the rooms are empty save for furniture no one has sat on in decades. You'll have the entire east wing for your personal use, bedroom, sitting room, and a study I thought you might appreciate, given your skill with accounts. The thoughtfulness of it caught Alice off guard. You prepared a study for me? You mentioned working on your household accounts until 3 in the morning. I assumed you might prefer space to continue managing your affairs without interruption. He paused. Unless I've overstepped. I'm told I have a tendency to make decisions without adequate consultation. Alice felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Beneath the cold aristocratic exterior, there were glimpses of something else, consideration, perhaps even kindness, buried under layers of practiced attachment. No, thank you. That was thoughtful. She met his gaze directly. Your Grace. Harold's expression hardened immediately. Harold. We're alone. Surely the formality. Especially when we're alone. He stood, moving to the window with restless energy. If you cannot maintain the intimacy in private, you'll never carry it convincingly in public. My aunt has the instincts of a predator, she'll sense any hesitation, any falseness. He turned back to face her. Say it. My name. Alice's throat felt tight. There was something intensely personal about using his given name, something that made the arrangement feel less like a business transaction and more like, she didn't know what. Harold. Again. As though you're accustomed to it. As though we've known each other for years rather than days. Harold. This time it came easier, rolling off her tongue with less effort. Is this how it will be? You issuing commands and expecting immediate obedience. His smile was sharp and fleeting. Only when you insist on clinging to propriety that serves neither of us. You're going to be living in my house, Alice. Sharing my meals, attending events at my side, convincing all of London that I'm so thoroughly besotted that I've abandoned decades of careful bachelorhood. He moved closer, and Alice felt her pulse quicken. The least we can do is use each other's Christian names. Alice stood, refusing to be loomed over. Even with the height difference, she could hold her ground. Very well. Harold. But I have one condition in return. His eyebrow arched. You're in no position to negotiate additional terms. Nevertheless. Alice lifted her chin. If I'm to live here, to play this part, I need honesty between us when we're alone. No pretense, no performance. Just truth. For a long moment, Harold said nothing. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. Agreed. Truth between us, at least within these walls. Alice placed her hand in his, and felt the warmth of his palm against hers. Then we have an understanding, Harold. We do, Alice. His fingers tightened briefly before releasing her. Welcome to Ashbourne House. Try not to let it swallow you whole. Chapter 3. Lady Beatrice Ashbourne arrived at precisely 7 o'clock, sweeping into the drawing room like a ship of war bearing down on unsuspecting coastal villages. She was tall, rail-thin, and draped in enough black bombazine to outfit an entire funeral party. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, cold and sharp as her eyes. Harold. She didn't offer her cheek for a kiss, merely inclined her head with the bare minimum of familial affection. I trust there's an explanation for this extraordinary summons. Alice stood beside the fireplace, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The gown Harold's modiste had delivered that afternoon was beautiful, rose silk with delicate embroidery at the bodice, but it felt like costume armor, insufficient protection against the force of Lady Beatrice's regard. Aunt Beatrice, allow me to present Miss Alice Shelton. Harold moved to Alice's side, his hand coming to rest at the small of her back with practiced ease. My fiancée. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Lady Beatrice's gaze raked over Alice from head to toe, lingering on every detail with surgical precision. Alice felt each imperfection catalogued and filed away, the slightly unfashionable style of her hair, the way she stood too rigidly, the faint shadows under her eyes from 3 sleepless nights in this enormous house. Shelton, Lady Beatrice said, the name landing like an accusation. The Hampshire Sheltons. I was under the impression that family had fallen on rather unfortunate circumstances. They experienced financial difficulties, Harold said smoothly. As many respectable families do. It has no bearing on Alice's character or breeding. Doesn't it? Lady Beatrice moved closer, circling Alice like a predator assessing prey. Tell me, Miss Shelton, where precisely did you and my nephew become acquainted? I cannot recall seeing you at any events this season. Or last season. Or indeed, any season at all. Alice's throat felt lined with sand. Harold had prepared her for this, drilling her on the fabricated story until she could recite it in her sleep, but having Lady Beatrice's cold stare fixed upon her made every rehearsed word evaporate from her mind. We met at the lending library in Cheltenham, Alice managed, her voice steadier than she felt. I was visiting my mother's cousin, and Harold was. Harold? Lady Beatrice's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. How remarkably familiar for such a recent acquaintance. We've been corresponding for nearly 8 months, Aunt Beatrice. Harold's tone carried a warning edge. I simply chose to keep the matter private until I was certain of my feelings. 8 months. Lady Beatrice's laugh was devoid of humor. And yet you've been actively pursuing the princess's daughter for the better part of a year. How does Miss Shelton reconcile that rather glaring inconsistency? The dinner gong sounded before Alice could formulate a response, its deep tone reverberating through the drawing room like a stay of execution. Shall we? Harold offered his arm to Alice, then his other to his aunt. Morrison has prepared crown roast. Your favorite, I believe. The dining room was set for three, the long mahogany table gleaming under candlelight. Crystal glasses caught and refracted the flames until the entire room seemed to shimmer with barely contained hostility. Alice found herself seated across from Lady Beatrice, Harold at the head of the table between them like a referee preparing for battle. The first course arrived, a delicate consommé that Alice had to concentrate not to spill as her hands trembled slightly. Lady Beatrice ate with mechanical precision, her attention never wavering from Alice's face. "Tell me, Miss Shelton," she said, dabbing at her lips with a napkin. "What are your accomplishments? Do you play?" "The pianoforte, moderately well." Alice set down her spoon, meeting Lady Beatrice's gaze directly. Her mother's training surfaced through the panic: never show weakness, never apologize for what you are. "I also read Italian and have a facility with mathematics." "Mathematics?" Lady Beatrice made it sound like a disease. "How terribly practical. And your family connections? Who are your people?" "My father was Sir Edmund Shelton of Hartfield Manor. My mother was Helena Waverley, daughter of the late Reverend Thomas Waverley of Somerset." Alice kept her voice level, factual. "We are not grand, Lady Beatrice, but we are respectable." "We're respectable," Lady Beatrice corrected. "Before your uncle squandered the family fortune at the gaming tables, if the rumors are to be believed." Harold's knife clattered against his plate. "Aunt Beatrice." "It's quite all right, Harold." Alice surprised herself with the steadiness of her own voice. She turned back to Lady Beatrice, something shifting inside her, less fear, more exhaustion with pretending to be smaller than she was. "Yes, my uncle has made poor decisions that have affected our family. I cannot change his actions, only manage their consequences. I've spent the last 3 years keeping my family from complete ruin through careful economy and determination. If that makes me unsuitable to be a duchess, then so be it." Silence fell over the table, broken only by the soft footsteps of footmen removing the soup course. Lady Beatrice studied Alice with new intensity, her expression unreadable. "You have spirit, at least. That's something." She turned to Harold. "Though I cannot fathom what possessed you to choose a penniless girl from a disgraced family over an alliance that would strengthen your position with the royal family. I chose Alice because I wanted Alice." Harold's voice was quiet but absolute. Not her connections, not her dowry, not what she could offer the Ashbourne legacy. Simply her. Something in Alice's chest constricted at the conviction in his voice, the performance so complete it almost felt real. Lady Beatrice set down her wine glass with deliberate care. "You're either a romantic fool or you're hiding something, Harold. I haven't decided which." Her gaze shifted to Alice. "But I'll be watching, Miss Shelton. Very carefully." "I would expect nothing less, Lady Beatrice," Alice replied, lifting her own glass. "Family should always look after one another's interests." For the first time that evening, something that might have been respect flickered across Lady Beatrice's face. She raised her glass in return. "Indeed they should, Miss Shelton. Indeed they should." Across the table, Harold caught Alice's eye, and the ghost of a smile touched his lips. She'd survived the first test. But as the main course arrived and Lady Beatrice launched into pointed questions about wedding plans, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that the real trials were only beginning. Alice found the study by accident, 3 nights after the dinner with Lady Beatrice. She'd been wandering the corridors of Ashbourne House in her dressing gown, unable to sleep, when she noticed a sliver of light beneath a door she'd assumed led to a linen closet. The door was ajar. Through the gap, she glimpsed floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a fire burning low in a grate, and Harold slumped in a leather chair with his head in his hands. She should have walked away. This was clearly a private moment, a space he'd retreated to when he thought himself unobserved. But something in the defeated curve of his shoulders stopped her, made her knock softly against the doorframe. "I'm not receiving visitors." His voice was muffled, rough around the edges in a way she'd never heard before. "Then it's fortunate I'm not a visitor." Alice pushed the door open wider. "I'm an intruder. Entirely different category." Harold looked up, and she caught her breath. His cravat was unknotted, hanging loose around his collar. His waistcoat was unbuttoned. His hair stood in disarray as though he'd been running his fingers through it repeatedly. But it was his eyes that arrested her, red-rimmed and exhausted, the careful mask he always wore completely absent. "Alice." He straightened slightly, some instinct toward propriety asserting itself even in his obvious distress. "You shouldn't be here. It's nearly 2 in the morning. Neither should you, by that logic." She stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her. The study was smaller than she'd expected, more intimate than the grand public rooms of the house. Books lined every wall, their spines worn from use rather than displayed for show. A desk was buried under correspondence and ledgers. The air smelled of leather, smoke, and the faint tang of brandy. "What is this place?" "My sanctuary." Harold reached for the glass on the table beside him, then seemed to think better of it. "The one room in this mausoleum that's actually mine. My father used it before me. And his father before him." He gestured to the chair opposite his own. "You might as well sit. I'm hardly in a position to enforce propriety tonight." Alice settled into the chair, tucking her feet beneath her dressing gown. The fire cast dancing shadows across Harold's face, making him look younger and infinitely more vulnerable. "What's happened?" "Letter from my estate manager in Yorkshire." Harold nodded toward the papers scattered across his desk. "Blight in the wheat fields. 2 of the tenant farms will produce nothing this season. The families will need assistance through winter, which means diverting funds from." He trailed off, rubbing at his eyes. "It doesn't matter. You didn't come here to listen to me complain about agricultural failures. I came here because I couldn't sleep and saw your light." Alice leaned forward, studying him in the firelight. "But now that I'm here, I'd like to understand. You have more wealth than most people could spend in 10 lifetimes. Why does one failed harvest distress you so completely?" Harold's laugh was bitter. "Because those tenant families depend on me. Their children will go hungry if I make the wrong decision about where to allocate resources. Do I repair the Eastern Bridge so the village can access the market, or do I subsidize grain purchases for the winter? Do I invest in new equipment for the mill, or do I reduce their rents to account for the failed crop?" He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "Everyone believes being a duke means endless luxury and no consequences. They don't see the hundreds of people whose livelihoods rest on my decisions." Alice understood then, with sudden clarity, why he'd seemed so exhausted that night at the theater. Why he'd let her sleep on his shoulder rather than wake her, because perhaps, for 40 minutes, her presence had been a respite from the constant weight of responsibility. "My father used to say that burden and privilege are 2 sides of the same coin," she said quietly. "The more you have, the more people depend on you. It's inescapable." Harold turned from the window, surprise flickering across his features. "Your father was a wise man. He was a terrible businessman who lost everything through misplaced trust in my uncle, but yes, he understood duty." Alice drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them in a gesture that would have horrified Lady Beatrice. I've spent 3 years trying to keep my family from destitution. I know what it's like to lie awake calculating how to make £5 stretch across 20 obligations. To feel responsible for people who didn't ask for your protection but need it desperately anyway. Something in Harold's expression softened. He returned to his chair, leaning forward until mere feet separated them. Is that why you agreed to this arrangement? Not just for the money, but because you're accustomed to sacrificing yourself for others? Perhaps. Alice met his gaze steadily. Though I could ask you the same question. You agreed to this charade to escape your aunt's matchmaking, but I suspect there's more to it. You're protecting yourself from something. Harold was quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My mother died when I was 12. She loved my father desperately, and when he died 2 years prior, it destroyed something in her. She simply faded. By the end, she barely recognized me. He stared into the flames. I watched love consume her entirely. I swore I would never allow myself to become that vulnerable to another person. Alice's throat tightened. So you've spent 20 years building walls. Walls keep people safe, Harold said. Walls keep things contained and predictable. Walls also keep people lonely. Alice stood, moving to sit on the ottoman at his feet, close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his eyes. Harold, what we're doing, this arrangement, it won't work if we're not honest with each other. At least here, in this room, can we dispense with the walls? His hand came up, almost of its own accord, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was achingly gentle, at odds with the careful control he usually maintained. You're dangerous, Alice Shelton. Because I ask uncomfortable questions. Because you make me want to answer them. His fingers lingered against her cheek for a heartbeat longer than necessary before he pulled away, the careful mask reasserting itself. It's late. You should return to your rooms before the servants begin their rounds. Alice stood, recognizing the dismissal for what it was, not rejection, but retreat. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Harold. The tenant families in Yorkshire. Help them through the winter. The bridge can wait another season. He looked up at her, something unreadable in his expression. That was going to be my decision. I know, Alice said softly. Good night, Harold. Good night, Alice. She slipped into the corridor, closing the door behind her, and stood for a moment in the darkness. Through the gap beneath the door, she could see his shadow move, could imagine him returning to his papers and his burdens and his carefully constructed solitude. Something had shifted between them tonight. Something that felt far more dangerous than any social performance or fabricated courtship. Something that felt dangerously close to real. Madame Rousseau arrived at Ashbourne House with an entourage that could have supplied a small military campaign. 6 assistants carried bolts of fabric in every conceivable color, while 2 more hauled a trunk overflowing with lace, ribbons, and embellishments that caught the morning light like scattered jewels. The modiste herself swept into the drawing room with the imperious air of a general surveying a battlefield. So, she announced in heavily accented English, circling Alice where she stood on a raised platform before the mirrors. This is the girl who has captured the Duke of Ashbourne's heart. Let me see what we have to work with. Alice fought the urge to cross her arms over her chest as Madame Rousseau's sharp eyes catalogued every angle and curve. Harold had insisted on being present, to approve the selections, he'd said, though Alice suspected he simply didn't trust her not to choose the most modest, least expensive options if left to her own devices. He sat now in an armchair by the window, ostensibly reviewing correspondence, but she could feel his attention on her like a physical weight. "The figure is good," Madame Rousseau declared, tugging at Alice's simple day dress. "Small waist, excellent proportions. But these shoulders, they are tense, no. You hold yourself like a woman expecting punishment." She clapped her hands sharply. "Relax, mademoiselle. We are creating beauty, not committing crimes." "I'm quite relaxed," Alice lied, her spine rigid as iron. From his chair, Harold made a sound that might have been a cough or suppressed laughter. Madame Rousseau began draping fabrics across Alice's shoulders, emerald silk that brought out hidden green flecks in her eyes, sapphire velvet that made her skin glow, blush pink satin that seemed too delicate for someone as practical as Alice felt herself to be. "The emerald," Harold said quietly, his correspondence forgotten. "That one." Madame Rousseau beamed. "Ah, your Grace has excellent taste. The color is magnificent with her complexion." She pinned the fabric expertly, creating the suggestion of a gown. "For the opera, perhaps. With gold embroidery at the bodice. Whatever you think appropriate." Harold's gaze hadn't left Alice's reflection in the mirror. "Though nothing too revealing. The goal is elegance, not spectacle." "Your Grace wounds me," Madame Rousseau said, though she smiled. "I have dressed 3 queens and a princess. I understand the difference between allure and vulgarity." For the next hour, Alice was transformed into a living mannequin. Fabrics whispered across her skin, pins pricked through cloth, and Madame Rousseau issued commands in rapid French to her assistants. Alice tried on day dresses and evening gowns, walking costumes and riding habits she would never use. Each outfit felt like putting on someone else's life, someone elegant and refined, someone who belonged in Harold's world. "What do you think?" Madame Rousseau asked, stepping back to admire a creation in ivory silk with delicate blue forget-me-nots embroidered along the hem. "For afternoon calls, non." Alice stared at her reflection. The girl in the mirror looked like someone from a fashion plate, polished and perfect. She barely recognized herself. "It's beautiful," she said carefully. "But perhaps too." "It's perfect," Harold interrupted, finally setting aside his papers and standing. He crossed to the platform, and Alice's breath caught as he circled her slowly, studying the way the fabric draped and gathered. "The embroidery is exceptional work. Your Grace is too kind." Madame Rousseau beamed. "But tell me, what does the mademoiselle think?" She has been very quiet about her own preferences. Alice met Harold's eyes in the mirror. "I think it's far more than I need. Or deserve." Something flickered across his face, irritation, perhaps, or concern. "Madam, if you'll excuse us for a moment. My fiancé and I need to discuss something privately." The modiste and her assistants withdrew with knowing looks, leaving Alice and Harold alone in the drawing room surrounded by scattered fabrics and half-finished dreams. "You don't deserve beautiful things?" Harold asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I didn't say that. I said it was more than I need." Alice stepped down from the platform, suddenly desperate to put distance between herself and the stranger in the mirror. "Harold, this is excessive. 6 evening gowns. 8 day dresses. I'll never wear half of them after our arrangement ends. Then keep them. Sell them. Do whatever you wish with them." He moved closer, and Alice found herself backed against the mirror, trapped between her reflection and the reality of him. "But while you're here, while you're playing this role, you will dress the part. Do you understand why?" "To convince society I belong at your side," Alice recited dutifully. "No. His hand came up, fingers catching her chin and tilting her face toward his. Because when you walk into a room dressed in silk and diamonds, when every eye turns to watch you, I need you to feel like you deserve to be there. Not for them, Alice. For yourself. The intensity in his blue eyes made her heart stutter. Why does it matter to you? Because, he stopped, seeming to struggle with something. Because I've watched you diminish yourself since the moment you arrived here. You take the smallest portions at dinner, you apologize for occupying space, you act as though your presence is an imposition. It's infuriating. Alice felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm trying not to be a burden. You're not a burden, you're— Harold released her abruptly, stepping back and running a hand through his hair in frustration. Madame Rousseau could dress you in the finest silks in Paris, and it wouldn't matter. Do you know what I noticed when she draped that emerald fabric across your shoulders? Alice shook her head mutely. Not the color, not the way it complemented your complexion. I noticed the way your eyes lit up when she mentioned gold embroidery, before you immediately shut down the enthusiasm and retreated back into practicality. He moved to the window, staring out at the gardens. That spark, Alice. That's what no amount of expensive fabric can replicate. And that's what I need people to see when they look at you. Alice touched the ivory silk of her current gown, feeling the smoothness beneath her fingers. You want me to be myself. I want you to stop hiding. Harold turned back to face her. The woman who stood up to my aunt at dinner, who found me in my study and asked uncomfortable questions about my burdens, that woman deserves all the silk and diamonds in London. Not because of who I am, but because of who she is. Silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither seemed ready to voice. Then I suppose, Alice said finally, a small smile tugging at her lips, you should call Madame Rousseau back in. I believe I'd like to discuss adding some ruby velvet to the order. Harold's answering smile transformed his entire face. Now you're being sensible. As Madame Rousseau and her entourage flooded back into the room, Alice caught Harold's eye once more. He watched her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something warm and dangerous and entirely too real for their carefully constructed charade. Chapter 6. The ballroom at Ashbourne House hadn't been used in years. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through tall windows, and the chandeliers hung draped in cloth like sleeping ghosts. Harold stood in the center of the parquet floor, his jacket discarded, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows in a way that made Alice's mouth go inexplicably dry. You cannot attend the Ashbourne Gala without knowing how to waltz, he said, gesturing for her to join him. It would raise questions we cannot afford to answer. I know how to waltz. Alice remained stubbornly near the doorway, clutching her skirts. My mother taught me when I was 15. Knowing the steps and dancing with me are entirely different matters. Harold crossed his arms, a challenge glinting in his blue eyes. When we dance at the gala, all of London will be watching. They'll be looking for any sign that our engagement is a fabrication. Hesitation, stiffness, lack of familiarity, any of those will damn us. Alice forced herself to walk forward, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. You're being dramatic. It's just a dance. Is it? Harold moved to an ornate music box on the sideboard, winding the mechanism until a waltz began to play, tinny and distant but unmistakably Strauss. Then you won't mind demonstrating your expertise. He offered his hand, and Alice took it with more confidence than she felt. His palm was warm against hers, his fingers closing firmly around her hand as his other arm came to rest at her waist. Even through the layers of her afternoon dress, she could feel the heat of his touch. Ready? He asked, and without waiting for her answer, he swept her into the first turn. Alice stumbled immediately, her rhythm completely wrong. Harold caught her easily, steadying her with a hand at the small of her back. "You're counting," he observed. "I can see you mouthing the numbers. Stop thinking and feel the music." "I am feeling the music," Alice protested, trying to find the beat again. 1 2 3, 1 2 3. "You're not." Harold pulled her closer, eliminating the proper distance between them. "You're performing the mechanics of a waltz. That's not what I need from you." Alice's heart hammered against her ribs, though whether from exertion or proximity she couldn't say. "Then what do you need?" "Trust." His voice dropped to barely above a murmur. "Stop trying to lead, stop anticipating, stop controlling every movement. Let me guide you." It went against every instinct Alice had developed over 3 years of holding her family together through sheer force of will. But she took a breath, relaxed her rigid shoulders, and let Harold take control. The difference was immediate. Suddenly they weren't fighting the music but flowing with it, Harold's sure steps carrying them across the ballroom in sweeping arcs. Alice found herself following without thinking, her body responding to the subtle pressure of his hand, the shift of his weight, the unspoken communication between them. "Better," Harold said, though his expression remained serious, focused. "But you're still holding back. Look at me, not at your feet." Alice lifted her gaze and found herself trapped in the winter blue intensity of his stare. This close, she could see the darker ring around his iris, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that appeared when he smiled, which wasn't nearly often enough. "At the gala," Harold continued, spinning her smoothly, "we need to convince 300 guests that I'm utterly besotted with you. That means no polite distance, no averting your eyes, no pretending you're anywhere else but in my arms. And how do I accomplish that?" Alice's voice came out breathier than intended. Harold's hand tightened at her waist, drawing her impossibly closer until barely an inch separated them. "Like this," he said, and the waltz transformed into something else entirely, something intimate and dangerous and utterly improper for an engaged couple who were supposed to be maintaining decorum. They moved together as though they'd been dancing for years rather than minutes. Alice became acutely aware of everything, the way Harold's thumb traced small circles against her palm, the warmth of his breath stirring the hair at her temple, the muscles shifting beneath his shirt as he guided her through a complex turn. "Harold," she whispered, though she had no idea what she meant to say. His eyes darkened. "If you look at me like that at the gala, we'll convince them quite thoroughly." "Like what?" "Like you've forgotten this is meant to be pretend." His voice was rough, strained. "Like you might actually," he stopped himself, jaw tightening. "We should practice the ending. The gala will conclude with a final waltz, and tradition dictates." But whatever tradition dictated was lost as Harold swept her into a final, dramatic turn. Alice's breath caught as he dipped her low, his arm an iron band supporting her weight. They froze there, suspended in the aftermath of the music, her back arched and his face hovering inches from hers. In that moment, with the afternoon sun streaming across them and the dust motes swirling like snow, Alice forgot about the arrangement. Forgot about the contract, the timeline, the carefully negotiated terms. She saw only Harold, not the Duke of Ashbourne, not the Iron Duke of London society, but simply a man whose careful control was fracturing in his eyes. Alice. Her name on his lips was half plea, half warning. She should pull away. Should laugh and make some light comment about successfully mastering the steps. Should reinforce the boundaries they'd so carefully constructed. Instead, she lifted her free hand to his face, fingers ghosting along his jaw. "What are we doing, Harold?" "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty in those 3 words was more intimate than any touch. God help me, Alice, I don't know any more. He drew her upright slowly, but he didn't release her. They stood in the center of the empty ballroom, still holding each other as though the music were still playing, as though they had any reason to remain in this embrace. The gala is in 3 days, Harold said finally, though he made no move to step back. We should practice again tomorrow. To ensure. Yes, Alice interrupted, because if he finished that sentence, if he gave another rational reason for why they needed to keep touching like this, she might do something catastrophically foolish. Tomorrow. Harold's hand slipped from her waist, leaving cold emptiness in its wake. He stepped back, rolling down his shirt sleeves with sharp, precise movements that suggested he was reassembling his composure piece by piece. Same time, he said, his voice carefully neutral again. We'll run through the opening set as well. Alice nodded, not trusting her voice. She turned and walked toward the door, every step feeling like tearing away from something she shouldn't want but absolutely did. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. Harold stood where she'd left him, staring at the place they'd danced, his expression unguarded and utterly devastated. Tomorrow, they would dance again. And Alice was terrified of what might happen when the music stopped. Alice was in the garden cutting roses when Morrison appeared on the terrace, his usually impassive face tight with disapproval. Miss Shelton, there's a gentleman demanding to see you. He's refused to leave his card and has been, rather insistent. The butler's tone suggested the gentleman in question had been far worse than merely insistent. I've placed him in the small receiving room, but I can have him removed if you wish. Alice's stomach dropped. She knew, even before Morrison spoke the name, who had come calling. Thomas Shelton, the butler confirmed. He claims to be your uncle. The shears slipped from Alice's fingers, landing among the roses. Does his grace know? The Duke is in his study with his man of business. I thought it best to alert you first. Alice's mind raced. Harold had settled her uncle's debts as promised, paid every creditor in full. Thomas should have no reason to come here, no leverage left to wield. Unless. She gathered her skirts and hurried inside, Morrison trailing in her wake. The small receiving room was at the back of the house, deliberately chosen for visitors who didn't merit the grandeur of the main drawing room. Alice paused outside the door, steadying her breathing, then pushed it open. Thomas Shelton stood with his back to her, examining a silver candlestick with the appraising eye of a man calculating its worth. He'd grown thinner since she'd last seen him, his clothes hanging loose and smelling of gin and desperation. Uncle Thomas. Alice's voice came out colder than she'd intended. To what do I owe this unexpected visit? He turned, and the smile that spread across his face made her skin crawl. Alice, my dear girl. Look at you, dressed in silk and living in a duke's house. You've done quite well for yourself, haven't you? I don't know what you mean. Don't play coy. Thomas moved closer, and Alice fought the urge to retreat. I know all about your little arrangement with the Duke of Ashbourne. Quite clever, really. You always were the smart one, more than your simpering mother or that foolish sister of yours. Alice's hands clenched at her sides. Emma has nothing to do with this. If you've come here hoping for money. Money? Thomas laughed, the sound harsh and grating. Oh, I've come for far more than money, niece. I've come to make a business proposal. I have no business with you. Ah, but the Duke does. Or rather, he will once I inform certain interested parties about the true nature of your engagement. Thomas pulled a folded paper from his jacket. I've written quite a detailed letter to Lady Pemberton describing how I discovered my destitute niece living in Ashbourne House, playing at being a duchess while His Grace settles debts on her behalf. Very suspicious circumstances, wouldn't you say? The blood drained from Alice's face. You wouldn't dare. Wouldn't I? I've nothing left to lose, Alice. You made certain of that when you refused to help me after your father died. His eyes glittered with malice. But I'm not unreasonable. Give me £5,000, and this letter never reaches Lady Pemberton. I'll disappear back to whatever hole you imagine I crawled from. I don't have £5,000. No, but your Duke does. And I suspect he'd pay quite handsomely to protect your reputation. Or rather, the illusion of your reputation. The door swung open with enough force to strike the wall. Harold stood in the threshold, his expression carved from ice and fury. Alice had never seen him look so dangerous. You suspect incorrectly, Mr. Shelton. Harold's voice was deadly quiet as he stepped into the room. You'll leave this house immediately, or I'll have you thrown out. Possibly from an upper-story window. Thomas paled but held his ground. Your Grace. How kind of you to join us. I was just discussing with my niece. I heard what you were discussing. The walls in this house are quite thin when one wishes them to be. Harold moved to stand beside Alice, his presence solid and protective. You'll surrender that letter, along with any copies you may have made. And if I refuse? Thomas tried for bravado, but his voice shook. Harold smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Alice had ever seen. Then I'll destroy you. Not with money, Mr. Shelton. You're quite right that £5,000 means nothing to me. But I have something far more valuable, influence. He pulled a document from his own jacket, unfolding it with deliberate care. This is a complete accounting of your debts, past and present. The gentleman you've borrowed from, the establishments you've been barred from, the rather creative forgery you attempted in Dover last month. Thomas's face went gray. You can't prove. I can prove all of it. With witnesses, documentation, and the full weight of the Ashbourne name behind the prosecution. Harold's voice was conversational now, almost pleasant. You'll hang, Mr. Shelton. Or perhaps they'll choose transportation. Australia is lovely this time of year, I'm told. The letter trembled in Thomas's hand. You're bluffing. Am I? Test me. Harold extended his hand. The letter. Now. For a long moment, Thomas stood frozen. Then, with shaking fingers, he surrendered the paper. Harold took it without breaking eye contact, folding it carefully and placing it in his pocket. Now, Harold continued, you'll leave London within the hour. If I hear you've contacted Miss Shelton or her sister, if I catch even a whisper of your presence in this city, I will make good on every threat I've just outlined. Do we understand each other? Thomas looked at Alice, something like hatred burning in his eyes. You think you're safe here? Playing dress-up in his house? You're nothing but. She is everything. Harold's words cut through the air like a blade. And you are nothing. Less than nothing. You're a pathetic man who attempted to profit from the misfortune of his own family. Now get out of my house before I forget I'm a gentleman. Morrison appeared in the doorway as though summoned, 2 footmen flanking him. They escorted Thomas from the room, his protests fading as they marched him toward the entrance. Silence fell. Alice stood rigid, her entire body trembling with reaction. Harold moved in front of her, his hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders. Alice, he said softly. Look at me. She raised her eyes to his, and the fury that had filled them moments before had transformed into something else, concern, warmth, and a fierce protectiveness that made her throat tighten. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to bring that kind of trouble to your door." "You brought nothing." He did. Harold's thumb traced along her collarbone in a gesture of comfort. "And he'll never trouble you again. I give you my word." "You threatened to hang him for me." "I would have done far worse if he'd continued." Harold's jaw tightened. "No one threatens you, Alice. No one makes you feel small or worthless or afraid. Not while I'm breathing." The vehemence in his voice shook something loose in Alice's chest. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and rested her forehead against his shoulder. Harold's arms came around her immediately, holding her close. "Thank you," she murmured against his shirt. She felt rather than heard his response, his words rumbling through his chest. "Always." Rain lashed against the windows of the library, turning the afternoon gray and close. Alice sat curled in the window seat with a book she wasn't reading, watching water stream down the glass in rivulets that blurred the gardens beyond recognition. She'd been at Ashbourne House for nearly 6 weeks now, and somewhere in the endless dinners and social calls and dancing lessons, the arrangement had stopped feeling temporary. That terrified her more than anything her uncle could have threatened. "You look melancholy." Harold's voice came from the doorway, startling her from her thoughts. He crossed to the sideboard, pouring 2 glasses of brandy without asking if she wanted one. "I've never seen you sit still for more than 10 minutes. It's unsettling." "I'm thinking." Alice accepted the glass he offered, their fingers brushing in a way that sent familiar electricity through her nerves. "Is that not permitted?" "Depends on what you're thinking about." Harold settled into the chair opposite her window seat, studying her with that penetrating gaze that always made her feel transparent. "The gala is tomorrow. You should be resting, preparing yourself for the performance of your life." Alice took a sip of brandy, letting it burn down her throat. "What if I don't want it to be a performance anymore?" The words escaped before she could stop them, landing in the space between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Harold went very still. "Alice. I know what we agreed." She set down the glass before her shaking hands could betray her. 3 months, a temporary arrangement, a mutually beneficial fiction. And at the end, we part ways and pretend this never happened. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "But somewhere between the theater and the waltz lessons and you defending me from my uncle, I forgot how to pretend." Thunder rumbled outside, filling the silence Harold left hanging. His expression was unreadable, carved from marble and shadow. "You don't know what you're saying," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "You're grateful. That's natural, given what I've done for your family. But gratitude isn't." "Don't." Alice stood abruptly, the book tumbling from her lap. "Don't diminish what I'm feeling by reducing it to gratitude. I'm not some naive girl who's confused obligation with affection." "Then what are you?" Harold rose to face her, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "Because 3 weeks ago you could barely look at me without flinching. Now you're standing here telling me you've forgotten how to pretend, and I need to understand what that means." "It means I've fallen in love with you." The confession tore free, raw, and terrifying. "Somewhere between your midnight vulnerabilities and the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. Somewhere between the study and the ballroom and every moment you've made me feel like I matter for who I am, not what I can provide." Harold's jaw clenched. "You can't love me." "Why not?" Harold's expression transformed, relief and joy breaking through his careful composure. He took her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that sent whispers rippling through the crowd. "I have the extraordinary honor," he announced, his eyes never leaving Alice's face, "of presenting my fiancée, Miss Alice Shelton, who has agreed to become the Duchess of Ashbourne." The ballroom erupted in applause, but Alice barely heard it. Harold was pulling her into his arms, and the orchestra was beginning a waltz, and suddenly they were spinning across the floor exactly as they'd practiced, except everything was different now. "Are you certain?" Harold whispered as he guided her through a turn. "Once we do this, there's no pretending it was all an arrangement. You'll be bound to me, to this life, to everything that comes with being a duchess." "I'm terrified," Alice admitted, her hand tightening on his shoulder. "I have no idea how to be what they expect. I'll make mistakes, I'll embarrass you." "You could never embarrass me." Harold's arm tightened around her waist. "Alice, I need you to understand what you're agreeing to. This isn't just about us. It's estates to manage, obligations to fulfill, a lifetime of scrutiny and expectation." "I know." Alice met his gaze directly. "And I'm still choosing you. Not the title, not the wealth, not any of it. Just you, Harold. Is that enough?" His smile was devastating. "It's everything." They spun past Lady Beatrice, who watched them with an expression Alice couldn't quite read. They swept by Lady Eugenia and Mrs. Crawford, both looking slightly disappointed that the scandalous engagement appeared to be genuine. They danced past Emma, who stood at the edge of the ballroom with tears streaming down her face and the most radiant smile Alice had ever seen. And as the waltz built to its crescendo, as Harold dipped her low exactly as he'd done in practice, Alice realized something profound. She'd spent 3 years holding her family together through sheer determination, sacrificing herself piece by piece to keep them afloat. But Harold hadn't asked her to sacrifice anything. He'd simply asked her to be brave enough to want something for herself. "I love you," she said as he drew her upright, the words meant only for him despite the hundreds of witnesses surrounding them. "I love you," Harold replied, and kissed her in front of all of London, propriety be damned. The ballroom erupted in scandalized gasps and delighted whispers. Lady Beatrice looked vaguely amused. Emma clapped her hands in glee. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, Alice thought she heard someone mutter about the Duke finally learning to smile. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Harold kept her hand clasped firmly in his. "Ready to face the rest of our lives as a very real, very public couple." Alice looked around the ballroom, at the opulence she'd been so intimidated by, at the society that had seemed impossible to navigate, at the future that had terrified her just weeks ago. None of it seemed quite so daunting now, not with Harold's hand in hers. "Ready," she said, and meant it completely. The arrangement was over. The performance had ended. What remained was the beginning of everything else. Thank you so much for watching. Your support truly means everything to me. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It only takes a second but helps immensely in bringing you more content like this. I've got another compelling video ready for you, just click on it now to continue. See you in the next one.